Hello everyone and welcome to another video. It feels like ages since I've sat here. In fact, I know it's ages because I had to clear loads of space and I actually haven't finished clearing loads of space because there's a stack of books here. But today I'm going to be bringing you my August wrap up, all of the books that I read in August. And I don't work very much in August. My work kind of stops over the summer. So I had a lot of time and I read a lot of books, like a lot of books. 17 to be specific, which is, it's a lot. It's a lot. So let's not faff around. Let's get straight to it. I'm going to leave in the description, as always, a list of books annotated as to where I got them from. So if I was given it for free or paid to read it, you will know in the description. But yes, let's get to it. I'm going to go through them quickly because otherwise you'll be here all day. The first book I read in August was Love's Legacy by Natalie Kleinman. It was billed as a Regency romance. I would argue it is not a Regency romance. It is a historical fiction featuring a romance set during the Regency period. So we had our main character, Patience, and her father dies. She has to go live with her cousin and find her own way in the world. And the reason I say I don't think it was a Regency romance is Regency romance is its own genre. You know, Bridgerton, lots of kind of, you've got rakes and you've got duels and you've got all these tropes in Regency romance, and we didn't have those. We didn't have the hallmarks of the genre. But it was still a great book set in the Regency era about a young woman finding her own journey and her own path. It did lose marks because she ended up with her cousin. I was not a fan of that. But yeah, that's the first book I read this month. On to the next one. Then I read Fool's Gold by PJ Skinner, and this is an adventure story set in the 80s. I believe it was the 80s. Doesn't say on the back, I believe it was the 80s. And follows the main character, Sam Harris. She is a newly qualified archaeologist and she goes on an adventure to South America to find hidden treasure. On the whole, enjoyed it. When we got to the actual treasure hunt, it was great. It just took a long time to get there, like a long time. But when we got there, I enjoyed it. So yes, I would say it kind of took a while to find its footing, but then I enjoyed the adventure bit towards the end. Then I gave myself a challenge, a little 24-hour reading challenge as to how many Alice Oseman books I could read in one day, and I read all of these. So I'm not going to go into detail because I did a whole reading vlog, which I will link in the description, but I will give you a quick overview of my thoughts right now. So first I read Solitaire, Alice Oseman's debut novel. This is about Tori Spring. I've read Heartstopper before. Obviously Tori's in the show. Really enjoyed it. Enjoyed it more than I thought I would, up until the last few chapters. Was not a fan of the last few chapters, but I loved the rest of it. Then I read This Winter, which is, they're all set in the same universe, but this one has the same characters, Tori and Charlie, and their younger brother as well, who I've briefly forgot the name of. Oliver. How could I forget Oliver? How could I forget Oliver? This is a novella set at Christmas. It was a lovely little read. Had a nice time reading it over lunch. Then Radio Silence, which I loved. This was so good, like so good. I did not expect this to be so good. It was great. Platonic friendships, internet friendships, fandomness, university sixth form stress. Basically this entire challenge was just me reliving like the years 2011 to 2014. But loved this one. It was great. And then I read Loveless, and I really enjoyed this one as well. I didn't enjoy it as much as Radio Silence, but I did really like it as a book. So yeah, those are my opinions. Quick fire on those Alice Oseman books, and you can watch the reading vlog for my full thoughts. Then I read one of my most anticipated releases this year. It was the audiobook of Husband Material by Alexis Hall. Now I loved Boyfriend Material and I loved the narration. I would highly recommend the audiobooks of these books They're so, so good. And Husband Material, again, I loved it. I had a great time. Was not expecting the ending, but he sold it. I wasn't convinced he could. It got to the last chapter, there was a bit of a twist, and I was like, oh no, you did not string me along for this. But then he sold it. And I have lots of thoughts and ideas about the themes in this book, but I can't discuss them without spoiling the ending. So maybe one day I'll do it as part of a like wider discussion on queer representation. But for now, it was glorious. We saw all of our favourite characters again. I had the best time. And then a nice little bit of social commentary as well. What's not to love? And every month I challenge myself to read one book from my Tudor TBR, which was shrinking and has now grown again. And this month I read Children of England by Alison Weir. This is a non-fiction book about, the tagline says the heirs of King Henry VIII. So Edward I can never remember his king number, 7th? 6th? Edward the 6th. Of course, Edward the 7th is a different, Edward the 6th, Mary the 1st, Elizabeth the 1st, and briefly Lady Jane Grey. It was really good, very insightful, very well written. Alison Weir's books, I always feel like she gets just the right amount of being accessible to non-historians. I'm not a historian by any means. Very much she's writing for the average person to pick it up off the shelf and read it, but also gives you a lot of depth, a lot of understanding as to how she knows what she knows. And this was a really interesting insight into that period. It was mostly about Mary the First, because it kind of starts just as Henry VIII died and finished just as Elizabeth I took the throne. So the majority of that time was about Mary the First. And I thought it was great how she managed to paint her in a more sympathetic light. So yeah, while still acknowledging the terrible things she did. Then I read The Rose, Volume 1, oh you can't really see it, there we go, by P.D. Oliver. And with this one, so it's futuristic dystopian horror with aliens and vampires, and it shouldn't work, but it does. And I did give this one 3 stars. The writing style just wasn't really for me, and the kind of character arcs weren't what I would have wanted them to be. But in terms of genre blending, if you just love genre fiction and you want as many genres in one fiction, can't fault it on that account. It was a really cool way of combining lots of different genres and tropes. And it's now tipping it down with rain outside, so you get to hear that as well. But yes, that's The Rose Volume 1. I think it's the first of a trilogy. Then I read Ellie Uncomposed by Valerie Niemerg. Now there's a bit of a story behind this one, in that I came across this book on Book Sirens, which is a website for small publishers and independent authors to share arcs of their books. And I saw it and I was like, this is the perfect book for me. And I downloaded it. And then the author got in touch with me to say, hey, I think you'd like my book. And I was like, funny story, I've already got it. So I read it, I loved it. And there's also an interview with the author in the link in the description, if you would like to read that. So Ellie Uncomposed. I'm a musician, I'm a classical musician, and I enjoy opera. I've been in a couple of operas when I was training and things. And this is a story about a modern day opera fan who gets lost in the story of The Marriage of Figaro, which is one of the most famous, best, and also most ridiculous operas of all time. So much happens. It's so convoluted, this plot. And she gets sucked into it and has to make sure that all the right things happen in the story. It's a trope I will always love. And it's the first time I've seen it in opera, and I thought it was so great. And what was really good is, you know, I know the story of Marriage of Figaro very well. I knew all the musical references, but even if you didn't, you could have followed along the story. The author has included footnotes which expand or explain different bits of like musical references or kind of how the opera works, but also with a nice dose of her sense of humour. You know, it was never dry, it was never like oh yeah, so this is this. Had a little bit of a spin, a little bit of a cheeky sense of humour on it. I had the best time. Great fun. Loved it. Then I listened to the audiobook for Unequal Affection by Lara S. Ormiston. This is inspired by Pride and Prejudice, a alternative Pride and Prejudice. So basically it's what if Lizzie had accepted Mr. Darcy's first proposal and they just had to make it work. And it was good fun. I think the major thing with something like this, like obviously that's a very pivotal moment in Pride and Prejudice, and to persuade us that Lizzie would make a different decision would have been very difficult, and I don't know if it was entirely successful. But once that first kind of hurdle was crossed, it felt very in character. It was kind of fun seeing how these characters explored their relationship and their friendship in a different way when they already had the knowledge that they were going to be married. I did listen to the audiobook and the narration was mostly fine, but very prim and proper. Her voice reminded me of, what's the actor's name? I can't remember the actor's name, but she played the original nurse on Call the Midwife, Jenny Lee. She played her on Call the Midwife. That's what the voice reminded me of. And I think, I don't know, sometimes could have used it a bit more fire and passion for Lizzie. But it was good fun. I think for any Pride and Prejudice fan, it's, you know, it's a nice alternative version. So my non-fiction read for this month was De Profundis by Oscar Wilde. This is the letter he wrote in prison to his lover, and it's a weird one to read because it's someone's letter, you know. It's not a book, a novel, an essay in that way. It is a letter that one person has written to one other person, and it's very long. He's clearly not okay, understandably, but a very emotional insight into where Oscar Wilde was physically and mentally when he wrote this. Next up, A Reservoir Man by L.J. Ambrosio. This is a kind of fictional biography, so it's one fictional character's life from birth until not quite death, but a conclusive moment towards his latter years. And I thought it was very emotional, very kind of transportive. The book took place over the whole lifetime of this character, but I just sort of whizzed through it and was absorbed and felt like I lived that whole lifetime all the way through. The prose was not my favourite, but the plot and the story and the characters were great. Then I read The Magus and the Fool by Akiva Hirsch. And this is one of those ones where I requested it on NetGalley when it had no reviews, and by the time I got around to reading it, it had lots of bad reviews. It was not good. It was not good. It's based on The Great Gatsby. It was marketed, billed as a queer positive, trans positive take on The Great Gatsby. That's a stretch. Basically, it's The Great Gatsby rewritten, but everyone's queer. But when I say everyone's queer, I mean they're all gay men except one woman who everyone hates and is written to be like the most hateable person on the planet. And her only character trait is that everyone hates her and her husband wishes he was with a man. And then I'm not even going to get started on the trans rep. It was not good. So I would recommend not reading this one. My full review is in the description. Yes, it was interesting. I know that Great Gatsby is public domain now, but I think we might need to just calm down. We don't need... It doesn't all need to be... Yeah, you know, we can calm down on the Great Gatsby retellings. Sometimes they don't need to be written. Then I read a wonderful book which made up for it, and that is Where We Go From Here by Lucas Rocher. This is a contemporary YA translated from Portuguese. It's set in Brazil, the author is Brazilian, and it follows 3 boys in their, or men in their late teens, early 20s, as they deal with how HIV affects their lives. So one of them has just tested positive. In the first chapter, he tests positive for HIV. One of them has known that he's HIV positive for a few years now. Another has tested negative, but is kind of in a will they won't they with the second man. So you've got all these intersecting lives, all these things they're trying to deal with in their own lives and helping each other with. And it was just so wonderful, such a wonderful story. The sense of community that I got from this story was amazing. I got to the end, I was just like a little bit of a wreck. And I was reading this at 5 a.m. at Heathrow, but it was still a bit of a wreck at the end, you know. I was just like, yeah. It can be really hard to pitch the tone of a story like this, and I thought it was just right, with that right balance of the fear and the stigma and the history of devastation that comes with HIV, but with an optimistic tone at the end that for these characters, it will be all right. They will be okay. They can deal with this, they can live with it, and it will be fine, and they have each other. So yes, brilliant book. Highly recommend. Speaking of brilliant books, The Attic Child by Lola J. This book blew my mind. It was fantastic. It was so good. It was so good. We have a kind of dual timeline, dual character things going on. So the first character we meet is Dikembe, who is at the start a young boy living in what was then known as the Congo in the very early 20th century. And he is essentially sold to a British explorer to be his companion, and is sort of, when he gets back to England, is paraded as this sort of, yeah, it's not, he has a terrible life. At first, he's treated relatively well, he's looked after, he's given an education, and then when the man who initially brought him to England dies, he suffers at the hands of the man's relatives and is abused and locked up in the attic. The other storyline we have is a young woman called Laura, I think it's Laura, who she's living in the 90s, and she finds out that her abusive stepmother has died, and she's inherited the home where she was also locked in the attic and abused by her stepmother. And while she's clearing out the house and having to relive all these memories, she comes across some objects which she can trace back to Dikembe, and she goes on a mission to uncover his story and tell his story. It's brilliant, so brilliant. The way the story unfolds, the kind of looming dread you have at some moments, the way that some really, really difficult storylines and themes are dealt with. It's very emotional read, but it wouldn't let you go. It's nearly 500 pages long, and I read it in like 2 sittings. I just couldn't put it down. I was so attached to these characters. I needed to know what happened, what his life was like, what her life would be like, and that they would emotionally be okay. Brilliant book. Cannot recommend it highly enough. And the final book, we made it to the end in less than 25 minutes of filming. Go me. Is Tell Me Anything by Skye Collane. This is a contemporary romance between, it's an MF romance, but both characters are bisexual, and it's a bit of a hurt comfort. There's a lot of angst. She's just come out of a terrible relationship and needs a lot of healing and support, and she meets this very nice, very handsome man who can provide some healing and support. And yeah, I enjoyed it. I didn't love it. I had a good time. What I thought was really good is the way that the queer community is depicted. Sky Cologne always does a really good job of that. And the different ways that the characters' sexualities and kind of being bi in a straight presenting relationship, and when you're part of the LGBT community, can't speak today. And when you're part of the LGBTQ community, but in a straight presenting relationship, what that's like. So lots of interesting things sort of dealt with in a good way in this book. That's it. All the books I read in August. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that you are very, very well. I hope that you read some good books in August, and let me know what you read in August. As I said, all of the links for the books are in the description. All of any written reviews that I've done are in the description. And I think that's everything. That's everything. I'll see you next time. Ta-ra for now.